Hi ladies, this will probably be the last video that I make for class. I'm going to talk about the last chapter in the book, and then I will cover some of what's going to happen between now and the end of the semester. So this last chapter of the textbook is about what we call non-canonical literature. And so in the 1st and 2nd century there was a lot of literature that was written about Jesus or his followers or something in relation to his story. And of course, not all of it was accepted into the Bible, and so these other pieces of literature are called non-canonical because they were not accepted into the canon. And so the book highlights some of the more well-known ones, and I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit about each one. So the first one is the Gospel of Thomas, definitely probably the most famous of these non-canonical pieces of literature. And this is what you would call a saying source, meaning that it's basically a list of 114 sayings of Jesus. And of them, 79 of them can be found in the canonical Gospels. And for that reason, some people believe that this could possibly be the Q source. I believe I talked about the Q source early on in the semester, but this would have been a source used by Matthew and Luke. There's a lot of material in Matthew and Luke that they share in common, but that is not in Mark's Gospel. And since we think Mark's Gospel was written first, they had to have another source that they both had a copy of, and it's possible that this was the Gospel of Thomas. Some people do believe that the Gospel of Thomas is Gnostic in nature because of its allusions to like dark and light, life and death, that kind of thing. And anyway, probably the primary reason it's not accepted into the Bible, but also I think it was lost for years and years. The next piece of writing is called the Gospel of Judas, again, lost for hundreds of years. But this gospel basically portrays Judas as being a very faithful and loyal follower of Jesus, and basically betrayed Jesus because he knew Jesus had to die because that would fulfill the prophecies, and ultimately that was his destiny. And so being the faithful friend, he did what he had to do. So that's the basic gist of the Gospel of Judas. There's one called the Secret Gospel of Mark, and actually these are just some verses that people believe, or some theologians believe, was originally part of the canonical Gospel of Mark, but they took these verses out and maybe possibly read them to people at their baptism. And it basically highlights the story of Jesus raising someone from the dead, which could possibly be corroboration of the raising of Lazarus in John's Gospel. But then also this person, this rich young man, later shows up to his house wearing nothing but a loincloth, and Jesus teaches him the mysteries of life. And so some people think, again, that what Jesus was doing was baptizing this man, and therefore this passage was read only at people's baptisms and was kept out for people who weren't baptized, so they didn't know this secret information. The Gospel of Peter is only a fragment. They don't have the full Gospel of Peter, but the part they do have really highlights the actual moment of the resurrection, and it shows these celestial beings coming from the heavens and rolling away the stone, and then Jesus walking out, and he's taller than the heavens, and this cross speaks and kind of testifies to his crucifixion. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas tries to tell some of the stories about Jesus from basically his birth until he was about 12. And in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, Jesus has these powers, but he doesn't know how to use them for good. So he's, as the book says, he's a holy terror. And all these really kind of evil things happen in the beginning, but as the book goes on, he learns how to use the powers for good. Again, there's good reasons these books weren't accepted into the Bible, and that one in particular might have been Gnostic in nature because Gnostics might not have had so much of an issue with evil because they felt like that was part of our design. The Infancy Gospel of James, or also known as the Proto-Evangelium of James, highlights the story of Mary, and it starts with her immaculate conception to Anna and Joachim, that she was raised in the temple when she became old enough to be married. She was betrothed to Joseph. Joseph was a widower, already had children, and became more like her guardian and preserved her celibacy or her virginity, and really gives credibility to the Catholic belief that she was forever a virgin. 1 Clement is a letter that's written from someone in Rome to someone in Corinth. And it kind of challenges a decision that was made in Corinth. They had just gotten rid of some of the leaders that had been left by Paul and were picking their own leaders. And what Clement, or the author of this letter, is saying is that, we have to be really careful about who we pick as leaders, and there needs to be a succession to that leadership. The D.K. is actually a very important document. This was supposedly written by the apostles, but we really don't believe that the apostles altogether wrote it. Some of the church fathers after the apostles probably wrote it. And it has two parts, one about the way of life and death, and then the second part is kind of a manual for early church rituals. And keep in mind that at this time there were all these preachers traveling all over and kind of saying different things. And so this manual, the D.K., became really important because it put in writing what it is the church actually believes and what their practices should be. And so this could be seen as the earliest form of a catechism. And then there's the Epistle of Barnabas, and they call it an epistle, but it really doesn't seem much like a letter. It's more like a sermon, and in the Epistle of Barnabas, it really criticizes Judaism. It's very harsh against Judaism, and basically says that the whole Old Testament is all predictor about Jesus being the Messiah. And he's really critical of Jews for not seeing that clearly Jesus was the Messiah. And then finally, the Acts of Paul and Thecla you'll read about. And this is much more probably a piece of fiction that was passed around, and people really enjoyed it because it really showed a woman empowered, and it was kind of one of those great adventure stories. But basically, Thecla is in her room and she overhears Paul preaching, and she decides to disobey her parents and refuse to marry the boy that she's supposed to marry and leave her parents' home. She starts following Paul and traveling with Paul. And when she's traveling with Paul, there's all these moments where she almost dies, but then is saved miraculously from her death. And they kind of credit that to her faithfulness and the wisdom of following St. Paul. So anyway, some pretty interesting literature that you'll get to read about. I do want to remind you that you do have one more discussion